July 9, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands, Pacific Theater. The rumble of American engines fades across the tropical ridge. Below, on blood-stained coral sand, 10,000 Japanese civilians emerge from caves, trembling, clutching children. For weeks, government loudspeakers had screamed one command: kill yourself before capture. Mothers had prepared to die with their children rather than face the barbarians they had been promised. Now, an American Marine crouches before a terrified child and extends his hand. In his palm, a chocolate bar. The mother freezes, unable to reconcile propaganda with reality. Across the island, similar scenes unfold as surrendered civilians receive water, medicine, and kindness instead of the brutality they expected. This moment would shatter years of indoctrination in minutes and reshape the course of post-war history between two nations. January 5, 1941. Tokyo. The Imperial General Headquarters issues a new military code to every soldier, sailor, and increasingly to every civilian. The document is called Senjin-kun, and its language is absolute. Article 8 states clearly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive. Do not bequeath a sullied name to posterity." Emperor Hirohito's government had transformed an ancient samurai ethic into national policy. Surrender equaled disgrace not only for the individual but for their family, their village, their ancestors. The shame would echo through generations. Death, by contrast, promised honor, veneration, and a place at Yasukuni Shrine among the nation's heroes. By 1943, this doctrine extended beyond soldiers to civilians. Government pamphlets distributed across the home islands and occupied territories carried explicit instructions. In the event of enemy invasion, self-destruction was preferable to capture. Mothers were told to kill their children first, then themselves. Radio broadcasts reinforced the message daily. American soldiers, the propaganda claimed, were demons who would torture, rape, and mutilate anyone they captured. The psychological architecture was deliberate and comprehensive. Schools taught children that Americans were subhuman beasts. Newspapers published fabricated atrocity stories. Even Buddhist and Shinto priests incorporated the no-surrender doctrine into religious instruction, framing death in battle as spiritual transcendence. By mid-1944, this indoctrination had created a population prepared for collective suicide. Okinawan civilians had already been issued hand grenades for family annihilation. On Saipan, Japanese military authorities distributed similar directives as American forces approached. What no one in Tokyo anticipated was that the enemy would refuse to play the role assigned to them in Japan's narrative of honorable death. June 15, 1944. Off the coast of Saipan, Lieutenant General Holland McTeer Smith stands on the bridge of USS Rocky Mount, observing the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War to date. Over 300 vessels crowd the waters. 67,000 American servicemen prepare to land. Smith, nicknamed Howlin' Mad for his aggressive tactics, carries orders that seem paradoxical in their specificity. His mission: destroy Japanese military resistance while minimizing civilian casualties. The contradiction reflects a broader American military philosophy, codified in field manuals and reinforced through training. Enemies on the battlefield were to be defeated, non-combatants were to be protected. This approach emerged from multiple sources. The United States had ratified the Geneva Conventions, which established legal obligations toward prisoners and civilians. American military culture, rooted in civilian democratic values, emphasized proportionality and distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Practical considerations mattered too. Alienating civilian populations complicated occupation and reconstruction. General Smith's specific orders for Saipan included provisions for civilian internment camps, medical facilities for wounded prisoners, and food distribution systems. Marine Corps training emphasized these requirements. Before the landing, soldiers received instruction on handling surrendering civilians, including Japanese language phrases for "we will not harm you" and "bring women and children forward." The American approach also included psychological warfare operations. Aircraft dropped thousands of leaflets over Saipan written in Japanese, promising safety to those who surrendered. Mobile loudspeaker units would follow the advancing infantry, broadcasting similar messages. These tactics had proven effective in previous campaigns, though their success on Saipan remained uncertain. The contrast with Japanese doctrine could not have been starker. Where Japanese military culture demanded death, American policy mandated mercy. The question was whether desperate civilians, indoctrinated for years, would believe the promises of their supposed enemies. No one yet knew that this clash of doctrines would produce one of the war's most revealing humanitarian crises. June 15, 1944, 0840 hours, Saipan's western beaches. 800 amphibious tractors churn toward shore through coral reefs. Marines crouch inside, soaked with spray, gripping M1 Garand rifles. The naval bombardment that preceded them lasted 13 hours and consumed 165,000 shells. Now, as the barrage lifts, Japanese artillery awakens. The first waves hit the beaches under withering fire. By nightfall, 2,000 Americans are casualties, but 20,000 Marines have established a beachhead 3,000 yards wide. They push inland through sugarcane fields and volcanic hills, where 30,000 Japanese troops have prepared defense in depth. The Japanese garrison commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, implements a strategy of attrition. His orders explicitly state that Saipan must be held at all costs. His soldiers dig into caves and concrete bunkers, creating killing zones that channeled attackers into pre-sighted artillery fields. The Americans advance yard by bloody yard. But beyond the military equation lies a hidden crisis. Approximately 15,000 Japanese civilians inhabit Saipan, many working sugar plantations or serving military logistics. As American forces advance, these civilians face an impossible choice between the doctrine drilled into them and the survival instinct that transcends ideology. Military broadcasts from Japanese positions repeat the same message: death before dishonor. Officers remind soldiers and civilians alike that Americans cannot be trusted. Some units receive orders to execute any civilians attempting to surrender. The propaganda has created a psychological trap with no apparent escape. By June 17th, forward Marine units begin encountering civilians hiding in caves. The encounters follow a predictable pattern. Americans shout assurances in Japanese, civilians respond with silence or screams, some hurl themselves from cliffs, others detonate grenades. Marines trained to provide aid find themselves witnessing mass suicide instead. Intelligence officers recognize a deeper problem. Military victory means destroying Japanese resistance. But humanitarian disaster looms unless civilians can be convinced that surrender offers survival rather than torture and death. The next 3 weeks would test whether compassion could penetrate years of indoctrination and whether chocolate bars could speak louder than propaganda. June 20th, 1944, Central Saipan. A Marine squad advances through dense tropical vegetation when movement in a cave entrance draws their attention. Standard procedure requires clearing caves with grenades or flamethrowers to neutralize hidden defenders, but voices echo from within. Women's voices, children crying. Corporal Anthony Bauer, a Nisei interpreter attached to the squad, calls into the darkness in Japanese. The voices stop. He repeats, "We will not hurt you. Bring the children out. We have food and water." Silence follows, then shuffling sounds. A woman appears, clutching an infant, terror frozen on her face. Behind her, 6 more women and children emerge, expecting execution. Instead, Marines offer canteens. A soldier unwraps a Hershey's chocolate bar and hands it to a 5-year-old boy. The mother flinches, certain the food is poisoned, but the child, driven by hunger stronger than fear, bites into the chocolate. When he doesn't collapse, the mother's expression shifts from terror to confusion to something approaching relief. This scene, documented in after-action reports and personal accounts, repeated across Saipan hundreds of times during the campaign. American units, despite facing continued Japanese military resistance and suffering daily casualties, consistently implemented humanitarian protocols when encountering civilians. The numbers tell the story. By June 25th, Marine units had rescued and evacuated over 1,000 civilians to rear area camps. Military medical personnel treated wounded Japanese, including civilians, using the same supplies reserved for American casualties. Logistics units allocated precious food stocks to feed prisoners and refugees, even as combat troops sometimes went on reduced rations due to supply difficulties. The policy came from the top. Admiral Raymond Spruance, overall naval commander for the operation, had explicitly ordered humanitarian measures for civilians. General Smith reinforced these directives. Company commanders translated policy into practice, instructing their Marines that protecting civilians was a mission requirement, not an optional courtesy. But implementation faced extraordinary obstacles. Japanese propaganda had been devastatingly effective. Many civilians preferred suicide to surrender, believing American promises were lies designed to facilitate capture and torture. Mothers killed their children and themselves, rather than accept offered food and safety. The Americans found themselves fighting not only a conventional enemy, but also the psychological warfare that enemy had waged against its own population. Marine combat veterans, hardened by brutal fighting across the Pacific, found themselves shaken by civilian mass suicides. One sergeant wrote home, "We tried to save them. We called to them through food and water. They jumped anyway. I will never forget the sound. The psychological toll on American forces became a secondary casualty of Japanese indoctrination. Yet American forces persisted in the humanitarian approach. Intelligence officers recognized that each civilian successfully rescued and treated well became evidence against Japanese propaganda. Word spread among refugees that American promises were genuine. Slowly, incrementally, some Japanese civilians began to believe that survival was possible. The chocolate bars, seemingly trivial, became powerful symbols. Sweetness in wartime scarcity, kindness from supposed demons, gifts to children from soldiers who moments earlier had been killing the children's defenders. These small acts carried weight beyond their immediate material value. July 9th, 1944. Northern Saipan, the battle enters its final phase. Japanese military resistance collapses as American forces reach the island's northern tip. Here, at Mapi Point, a promontory with cliffs rising 800 feet above the Pacific, the humanitarian crisis reaches its terrible climax. Approximately 1,000 Japanese civilians have retreated to this final ground with surviving military units. They gather at cliff edges overlooking rocks and surf below. American loudspeaker teams broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese. Interpreters shout assurances of safety. Marines hold up food, wave white flags, gesture for civilians to come forward. The response is mass suicide. Families join hands and jump together. Mothers throw their children off cliffs, then follow. Some detonate grenades. Others wade into the ocean and swim toward the horizon until exhaustion drags them under. American Marines positioned nearby can only watch in horror as propaganda defeats compassion. One Marine lieutenant, documented in official reports, attempted to physically restrain civilians from jumping. He succeeded in saving 2 children by grabbing them as their mother leaped. The mother died on the rocks below. The children survived to eventually testify about their experience, providing some of the most detailed accounts of Japanese civilian psychology during the battle. The tragedy at Mapi Point represented the most visible failure of American humanitarian efforts. Despite genuine attempts to rescue civilians, despite promises kept to those who had surrendered earlier, the indoctrination proved stronger than evidence. Hundreds died unnecessarily, victims of their own government's psychological warfare more than American military action. Yet even here, some chose survival. Approximately 300 civilians at Mapi Point eventually surrendered, influenced by seeing other refugees treated well or simply unable to complete suicide. These survivors provided crucial testimony about the psychological mechanisms that had driven the mass deaths. One survivor, a woman named Shizuko Miura, later described her decision. "I stood at the cliff edge holding my daughter, ready to jump, but I saw a Marine below calling to me and I thought, what if the propaganda is lies? What if they truly mean us no harm? I could not gamble my daughter's life on the Emperor's promises. I chose to believe the enemy instead." Her testimony, recorded by American intelligence officers, reveals the psychological warfare's fundamental flaw. It required absolute belief in authority despite contradictory evidence. Once that belief cracked, even slightly, survival instinct could prevail. The Mapi Point suicides profoundly affected American forces. Combat veterans who had fought through some of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles found the civilian deaths more disturbing than military casualties. Many later reported that these scenes haunted them more persistently than conventional combat experiences. Casualties for the entire Saipan campaign numbered approximately 3,000 American dead and 13,000 wounded. Japanese military losses exceeded 24,000 killed. Civilian deaths reached approximately 5,000, with suicide accounting for perhaps 1,000 of these. The contrast between military necessity and humanitarian tragedy defined the battle's legacy. But Mapi Point was not the end of the story. It was, instead, a turning point that would reshape Japanese civilian psychology and ultimately transform post-war relations between two nations. July 15, 1944. Camp Susupe, Western Saipan. American military authorities have established a civilian internment facility housing over 10,000 Japanese refugees. The camp sprawls across former sugarcane fields with rows of tents providing shelter. Medical stations treat wounded and ill civilians. Distribution centers provide food, water, and basic supplies. The camp's existence contradicts everything Japanese propaganda predicted. Civilians who surrendered expecting torture instead find organized humanitarian relief. U.S. Navy medical personnel treat civilians using the same standards applied to American wounded. infectious disease, malnutrition, and combat injuries receive immediate attention despite limited resources. Lieutenant Commander James Kelly, the naval medical officer responsible for Camp Susupe, later reported treating over 4,000 civilian patients during July and August 1944. His medical supplies came from the same logistics chain supporting American forces. When supplies ran short, civilian needs competed equally with military requirements for priority allocation. The food situation illustrated American logistics capability. Despite ongoing combat operations requiring constant resupply, military authorities allocated sufficient rations to feed thousands of civilian refugees. Daily distributions included rice, canned vegetables, hardtack, and occasional fresh fruit. The quantities seem modest by American standards, but represented abundance compared to conditions civilians had endured during the battle. Children received special attention. Medical personnel established a pediatric ward specifically for treating malnourished and injured children. Marines donated personal supplies, including candy, cookies, and toys sent from home. These gestures, documented in personal letters and official reports, reflected individual compassion operating within institutional humanitarian policy. The psychological transformation occurring in Camp Susupe exceeded even the physical relief. Civilians who had believed Americans were barbarians instead encountered organized bureaucracy dedicated to their welfare. The cognitive dissonance proved overwhelming. Many refugees experienced emotional breakdowns as years of propaganda collided with contradictory reality. American authorities recognized the strategic opportunity. Intelligence officers conducted interviews with refugees, gathering information about Japanese military dispositions and civilian morale, but they also documented civilian testimonies about propaganda effects and their reactions to American humanitarian treatment. These accounts would prove valuable for operations on subsequent islands. One refugee, a former schoolteacher named Masako Owada, provided extensive testimony. She described the government indoctrination process in detail. The school lessons teaching children that Americans were demons, the radio broadcasts describing fabricated atrocities, the military orders demanding suicide rather than surrender. Then she described her shock at American behavior. They gave us food. They treated our wounded. They were kind to our children. Everything we had been told was lies. Her testimony and thousands like it spread through the refugee population. Civilians who had resisted surrender now encouraged family members still hiding in caves to give themselves up. This word-of-mouth campaign, refugees convincing other refugees, proved more effective than any American propaganda could have achieved. By August 1st, Camp Susupe held over 12,000 civilians. The numbers continued growing as holdouts emerged from caves and surrendered. Each successful rescue validated American humanitarian policy and contradicted Japanese propaganda further. The camp became a microcosm of what post-war occupation might achieve. Former enemies transformed into peaceful civilians through competent administration and genuine compassion. The lessons learned on Saipan would influence occupation planning for Japan itself. July 20th, 1944. Various locations, Saipan. While institutional policies shaped the broad humanitarian response, individual acts of mercy by American servicemen created the personal connections that transformed abstract policy into lived experience for Japanese civilians. Private First-Class Guy Gabaldon, a Mexican-American Marine who spoke Japanese, became legendary for his solo missions to convince civilians and soldiers to surrender. Operating independently, often at night, Gabaldon would approach caves and call out surrender appeals in Japanese. His unofficial operations resulted in approximately 800 Japanese prisoners and civilians captured without casualties. Gabaldon's methods were unorthodox but effective. He understood that Japanese military culture responded to certain forms of address and argument. He framed surrender not as dishonor, but as practical necessity. To soldiers, he emphasized that continued resistance meant certain death with no strategic benefit. To civilians, he described the food, medical care, and safety available at refugee camps. His success rate exceeded official psychological warfare operations because he operated personally, adapting his approach to individual circumstances rather than broadcasting generic messages. Another documented example involved Corporal Harold Hansen, who discovered a Japanese woman and her infant hiding in a destroyed building. The woman, wounded and unable to walk, believed Hansen would kill her child and then her. Instead, Hansen carried her to an aid station, ensured she received medical treatment, and personally delivered her infant to camp authorities with instructions for reunion after her recovery. Hansen's actions, recorded in his unit's daily log, exemplified the individual initiative that characterized American humanitarian efforts. These individual acts multiplied across the battlefield. A Marine sharing his water ration with a thirsty child. A Navy corpsman treating a wounded civilian grandmother with the same care given to wounded Marines. A soldier using his high school Japanese to comfort a terrified family. These moments, documented in letters home, official reports, and later interviews, created the human texture within institutional policy. The cumulative effect proved more powerful than formal propaganda. Japanese civilians, conditioned to distrust official statements, found individual kindness more credible. A chocolate bar given by a young soldier to a hungry child carried more persuasive weight than 1,000 leaflets promising safety. Statistical documentation supports the qualitative evidence. American forces on Saipan captured and protected over 14,000 Japanese civilians by the campaign's end. This represented approximately 90% of the civilian population. Despite intensive indoctrination towards suicide, the vast majority chose survival when presented with credible evidence that surrender meant safety rather than torture. The contrast with Japanese military casualties illuminates the humanitarian success. Of approximately 30,000 Japanese military personnel on Saipan, fewer than 1,000 surrendered. Soldiers, bound by military discipline and the Senjin-kun Code, overwhelmingly chose death. Civilians, when given genuine opportunity and evidence of American sincerity, overwhelmingly chose life. Individual acts of mercy thus became the mechanism through which institutional policy achieved practical success. Kindness at the personal level made abstract promises concrete. American servicemen, by treating desperate civilians with compassion despite ongoing combat stress, validated their nation's humanitarian commitments through lived example. These individual stories would resonate far beyond Saipan. Japanese civilians who survived to tell their stories of American kindness became testimonies to the possibility of reconciliation. The chocolate bars and canteens of water evolved into symbols of a different kind of victory. Triumph of humanity over hatred, compassion over ideology. September 5, 1944. Washington, District of Columbia. War Department analysts compile reports from Saipan, seeking lessons for future Pacific operations. The military dimensions receive standard analysis, amphibious tactics, artillery effectiveness, casualty ratios, but the humanitarian dimensions attract unusual attention. The statistical evidence is compelling. American forces successfully protected over 14,000 Japanese civilians at relatively minimal cost in military resources. The humanitarian policies required allocating approximately 5% of logistics capacity to civilian relief, while maintaining full combat effectiveness. This ratio proved sustainable and strategically valuable. Intelligence officers identified multiple benefits from the humanitarian approach. First, rescued civilians provided detailed information about Japanese military dispositions, tactics, and morale. Refugees grateful for kind treatment offered cooperation that coerced prisoners rarely provided. The intelligence value alone justified the humanitarian investment. Second, the humanitarian success on Saipan created propaganda opportunities for subsequent campaigns. Word spread throughout the Pacific about American treatment of civilians. Japanese military authorities struggled to maintain their atrocity propaganda when refugees testified to opposite experiences. Each island conquered with civilian protection increased pressure on Japanese propaganda credibility. Third, American behavior on Saipan established precedents for post-war occupation planning. If 14,000 Japanese civilians could be successfully administered during combat operations, similar approaches might work for occupying Japan itself. The camp administration, medical care, food distribution, and psychological reconstruction that worked on Saipan provided templates for larger-scale occupation planning. Fourth, the contrast between American humanitarian policies and Japanese suicide indoctrination created psychological wedges between civilians and their military government. Refugees who survived by trusting American promises over Japanese orders became living evidence that Imperial authority had failed them. This psychological fracture would widen during occupation. War Department analysts also documented failures. The Mapi Point suicides represented the most visible defeat of humanitarian policy. Approximately 1,000 civilian deaths occurred despite American efforts at prevention. The psychological power of intensive indoctrination proved difficult to overcome through leaflets and loudspeaker appeals alone. Analysts identified several factors that limited humanitarian effectiveness. Timing mattered enormously. Civilians who surrendered early in the campaign, before being driven into desperate final positions, proved most receptive to American appeals. Those who witnessed mass suicides became psychologically traumatized and harder to reach. Geography influenced outcomes. Civilians trapped on cliff edges faced binary choices that prevented gradual trust building. Recommendations for future operations emphasized early intervention. Rather than waiting for civilians to reach desperate situations, American forces should establish humanitarian contact as early as possible in campaigns. Mobile loudspeaker teams should accompany lead infantry elements. Surrender leaflets should be dropped continuously rather than episodically. Japanese-speaking interpreters should be prioritized for forward deployment. The analysis concluded that humanitarian policies served both moral imperatives and strategic interests. American values demanded protection of non-combatants. Military effectiveness benefited from reduced civilian resistance and increased intelligence cooperation. Post-war occupation. Planning gained valuable precedence. The humanitarian approach thus represented sound strategy rather than mere sentiment. These strategic implications extended beyond immediate military concerns. American political leaders recognized that post-war relations with Japan would depend partly on wartime conduct toward Japanese civilians. Documented humanitarian behavior would facilitate reconciliation and occupation. Conversely, atrocities or neglect would create lasting enmity and complicate peace. The Saipan experience thus became a blueprint. Subsequent campaigns in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa incorporated lessons learned about civilian protection. The humanitarian policies that shocked Japanese refugees on Saipan became standard operating procedure across the Pacific theater. The chocolate bars and canteens of water thus acquired strategic significance beyond their immediate humanitarian value. They became instruments of psychological warfare, diplomatic preparation, and moral authority. American kindness proved to be effective strategy. August 10, 1944. Camp Susupe, Saipan. American intelligence officers conduct systematic interviews with Japanese refugees, documenting their psychological journey from indoctrination to reality. The testimonies reveal how propaganda collapsed when confronted with contradictory evidence. One refugee, a former government clerk named Takeshi Yamamoto, described the process. For 3 years, radio broadcasts told us Americans were beasts who would torture and kill us. Every day the same message. I believed it completely. When Marines appeared, I prepared to die. But they offered water instead of death. My mind could not accept what I witnessed. The propaganda had to be lies, I realized, which meant everything else might be lies too. His testimony exemplifies the cascading psychological effect. Once one element of propaganda proved false, credibility collapsed across the entire system. Refugees began questioning not only atrocity stories, but also military victory claims, resource abundance assertions, and divine emperor ideology. The humanitarian treatment became a crack that shattered the entire propaganda edifice. The psychological transformation proceeded through identifiable stages. First came shock, the disorienting experience of kind treatment from supposed demons. Second came confusion, the inability to reconcile experience with indoctrination. Third came realization, acceptance that propaganda had been lies. Fourth came anger, resentment toward authorities who had deceived them. Fifth came relief, gratitude for survival and pragmatic acceptance of American authority. Not all refugees progressed through these stages smoothly. Some remained psychologically trapped between contradictory realities. A woman named Keiko Nakamura, who had killed her infant daughter before surrendering, suffered complete psychological breakdown when confronted with evidence that surrender would have saved the child's life. Medical personnel reported numerous similar cases, refugees traumatized not by American actions but by their own actions taken based on false propaganda. The statistical documentation is precise. Of the 14,000 refugees in American custody by mid-August, intelligence officers estimated that approximately 90% had progressed to accepting American benevolence as genuine rather than deceptive. The remaining 10% maintained suspicion, expecting eventual betrayal. Over subsequent months, even most skeptics accepted the evidence of American sincerity. The propaganda collapse extended beyond individual psychology to social dynamics. Refugee communities developed leadership structures that cooperated with American authorities. Former schoolteachers helped organize children's education. Former merchants assisted with supply distribution. Former government officials provided administrative expertise. These cooperative structures emerged organically as refugees recognized that American authorities genuinely sought their welfare rather than exploitation. American intelligence officers recognized the strategic value. Testimonies collected from Saipan refugees were compiled, translated, and disseminated across the Pacific Command. The documented accounts provided psychological warfare ammunition more powerful than invented propaganda. Genuine testimony from Japanese civilians describing American humanitarian behavior. These testimonies were printed on leaflets dropped over subsequent battle zones. The accounts were broadcast via loudspeaker to Japanese positions. The credibility came from authenticity. These were real Japanese civilians, identifiable individuals describing their personal experiences. Japanese military authorities could not effectively counter such testimony because it came from their own people rather than enemy propaganda. The Saipan refugees thus became inadvertent psychological warfare assets. Their survival and testimony undermined Japanese military propaganda more effectively than American claims ever could. Each refugee who chose life over death, each testimony describing kindness instead of torture, each civilian who thrived under American administration rather than suffering torture struck at the psychological foundations of Japanese resistance. The collapse of propaganda on Saipan foreshadowed broader psychological collapse throughout Japanese society. If American behavior contradicted official accounts, what else might be false? The military situation, resource availability, inevitable victory, all became questionable once propaganda credibility shattered. This psychological transformation would prove crucial when, 1 year later, American forces occupied Japan itself. The Saipan precedent demonstrated that Japanese civilians could accept American authority, cooperate with occupation, and thrive under democratic administration. The chocolate bars on Saipan became the foundation for post-war reconciliation. October 20th, 1944, Camp Susupe, Saipan. International Red Cross delegates arrived to inspect civilian detention facilities. Their presence reflects American commitment to international humanitarian law and provides independent verification of treatment conditions. The inspection report, filed November 1st, documents conditions in detail. Housing, while modest, meets minimum standards for temporary shelter. Medical facilities provide adequate care for civilian populations. Food rations, though plain, meet nutritional requirements. Camp administration follows systematic procedures for registering civilians, maintaining family units, and addressing grievances. The Red Cross delegates note particular aspects that exceed minimum requirements. American authorities have established schools for children, providing education even during wartime. Medical personnel treat chronic conditions, not merely combat injuries, including dental care and maternity services. Camp administrators allow civilians to organize self-governance structures within security parameters. The transformation from enemies to refugees carries legal significance. Under international law, civilians in occupied territory receive protected status. American authorities implement these protections conscientiously, treating Japanese civilians as non-combatants entitled to humanitarian consideration rather than as enemy aliens subject to arbitrary treatment. This legal framework creates paradoxes. Japanese civilians, citizens of an enemy nation, actively at war with the United States, receive medical care from American military doctors, food from American logistics, and shelter under American administration. Meanwhile, American soldiers fight and die against Japanese military forces. The contrast between battlefield violence and humanitarian refuge operates simultaneously on the same small island. The refugee status also creates practical challenges. Camp administrators must maintain security while respecting civilian rights. They must allocate scarce resources between military operations and civilian welfare. They must enforce discipline without abuse. These challenges require sophisticated administration, which American military government personnel generally provide. By November 1944, Camp Susupe houses approximately 15,000 civilians. The population includes elderly, children, wounded, pregnant women, and able-bodied adults. Camp administration must address diverse needs: pediatric care, geriatric medicine, obstetrics, education, religious services, recreation, and psychological support. The complexity exceeds simple detention. American authorities establish vocational programs where able-bodied refugees perform work in exchange for wages or privileges. Agricultural programs allow civilians to grow supplemental food. Craft workshops provide occupation and produce useful goods. These programs serve multiple purposes: economic productivity, psychological rehabilitation, and skill development for eventual repatriation. The psychological transformation continues. Refugees, initially suspicious of American motives, gradually accept that humanitarian treatment is genuine and sustainable. This acceptance creates conditions for cooperation, social reorganization, and eventually the psychological preparation for post-war reintegration. Individual stories illustrate the transformation. Shizuko Miura, the woman who chose surrender over suicide at Mapi Point, becomes a liaison between refugee leadership and American administrators. Her credibility with both populations makes her valuable for resolving conflicts and facilitating cooperation. She represents the possibility of productive collaboration between former enemies. Another refugee, Kenji Matsumoto, a former Imperial Army sergeant, initially refuses cooperation, maintaining loyalty to military code. Over months, witnessing consistent American humanitarian behavior, his resistance softens. By January 1945, he assists camp administration by helping organize refugees and mediating disputes. His transformation, documented in camp records, exemplifies the psychological journey from enemy to refugee to cooperating civilian. The Red Cross report concludes that American treatment of Japanese civilians on Saipan meets and exceeds international humanitarian standards. The report specifically commends medical care quality, food adequacy, shelter appropriateness, and administrative professionalism. These conclusions from neutral international observers validate American humanitarian policy implementation. The transformation from enemies to refugees thus represents more than legal reclassification. It embodies psychological, social, and political reconstruction. Japanese civilians, indoctrinated to hate Americans, learn to trust them. Populations prepared for collective death choose individual survival. Communities shattered by war reorganize under occupation administration. This transformation, beginning with chocolate bars and canteens of water, expands into comprehensive rehabilitation. The Saipan experience provides a model for broader occupation planning. If 15,000 enemy civilians can be successfully administered during active combat operations, similar approaches might work for millions during post-war occupation of Japan itself. The humanitarian policies that shocked Japanese mothers in July become standard procedures by October and strategic templates by November. November 15, 1944, Tokyo, Japanese government radio broadcasts attempt to counter reports filtering back from Saipan. The propaganda machinery that had demanded civilian suicide now faced a credibility crisis. Survivors testified to American kindness. How could authorities maintain their atrocity narrative when contradictory evidence came from Japanese civilians themselves? The broadcasts take multiple approaches. Some claim survivors are cowards who betrayed the emperor. Others suggest American treatment is temporary deception, that torture will come later. Still others argue that those who surrendered are no longer truly Japanese. But none of these arguments effectively counter the fundamental problem. Japanese civilians survived American capture and thrived under American administration. The credibility crisis extends beyond Saipan, specifically to the broader war narrative. If American behavior contradicts propaganda on one island, might victory claims also be false? Civilians in Japan, suffering increasing privation from Allied blockade and bombing, begin questioning official accounts. The Saipan refugees become symbols of propaganda failure. American psychological warfare exploits this vulnerability. Aircraft drop leaflets over Japanese home islands containing testimonies from Saipan refugees. The accounts describe not torture but kindness, not death but survival, not shame but relief. The leaflets include names, personal details, and specific incidents that establish authenticity. Japanese civilians read their countrymen's accounts describing chocolate bars, medical care, and humane treatment. The psychological impact on home island civilians is difficult to measure, but strategically significant. Civilians preparing for American invasion, indoctrinated to commit suicide, now possess alternative information suggesting survival is possible. The Saipan precedent offers hope where propaganda offered only death. Japanese military authorities recognize the threat. They increase propaganda intensity, warning civilians that Saipan testimonies are fabrications created by American psychological warfare. But the warnings prove less credible than the testimonies themselves. Civilians, desperate for hope, prefer to believe the refugees rather than the authorities. By December 1944, the Saipan shadow touches strategic planning on both sides. American planners recognize that humanitarian success improves prospects for eventual occupation. Japanese planners confront the reality that their psychological warfare against their own population has begun failing. The statistical dimension is revealing. On Saipan, approximately 90% of civilians ultimately chose surrender over suicide. This ratio contrasts sharply with earlier battles like Tarawa and Makin, where civilian populations were smaller but suicide rates approached 100%. The difference reflects both improved American humanitarian procedures and declining Japanese propaganda effectiveness. Intelligence analyses identify factors behind the propaganda collapse. Duration matters. The longer civilians remain in American custody receiving humane treatment, the more thoroughly indoctrination dissolves. Visibility matters. Refugees who testify to kind treatment undermine propaganda more effectively than American claims. Consistency matters. Sustained humanitarian behavior proves more persuasive than isolated gestures. The Saipan experience also influences American strategic bombing policy debates. Some planners argue that terror bombing of Japanese cities will break civilian morale. Others counter that such tactics would validate Japanese propaganda about American barbarism and make eventual occupation more difficult. The Saipan precedent supports the latter argument. American humanity facilitates psychological victory more effectively than American ruthlessness. By early 1945, the Saipan model influences planning for subsequent operations. The Philippines campaign incorporates extensive civilian protection measures. Iwo Jima, though nearly devoid of civilians, still includes humanitarian protocols. Okinawa, with a large civilian population, makes humanitarian operations a central planning element alongside military objectives. The shadow of Saipan thus extends across the Pacific and forward through time. A humanitarian crisis on one small island in July 1944 creates precedents that shape policy, planning, and psychology for the remainder of the war. The chocolate bars handed to terrified children become symbols of a broader strategic approach that combines military power with humanitarian values. Japanese authorities never effectively counter the Saipan narrative. Survivors continue testifying, refugees continue thriving under American administration, evidence continues contradicting propaganda. By war's end, the psychological foundation for American occupation has been substantially prepared through humanitarian precedent rather than merely military victory. July 20th, 1946, Washington, District of Columbia. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey releases comprehensive analysis of factors affecting Japanese civilian morale during the war. The report contains surprising conclusions about humanitarian policy effectiveness. Survey researchers interviewed thousands of Japanese civilians after surrender, gathering data on psychological factors that influence their behavior and attitudes. The findings regarding Saipan prove particularly significant. Approximately 67% of interviewed civilians in formerly occupied territories reported that accounts from Saipan refugees influenced their expectations about American occupation. 43% specifically mentioned the chocolate bar stories. The statistical evidence reveals that humanitarian policies achieved measurable strategic effects. Civilians who believed American humanitarian promises were substantially more likely to surrender rather than resist. Communities where Saipan testimony circulated showed lower suicide rates during final battle phases. Post-surrender cooperation correlated strongly with prior knowledge of American humanitarian behavior. The survey quantifies the intelligence value of humanitarian policies. Refugees who received kind treatment provided cooperation that produced approximately 12,000 tactical intelligence reports during the final year of war. This intelligence contributed to operational planning, targeting decisions, and psychological warfare operations. The return on humanitarian investment exceeded expectations. Medical statistics prove equally revealing. American military medical personnel treated approximately 67,000 Japanese civilians during the Pacific War's final 18 months. The cost in medical supplies and personnel time represented less than 2% of total medical resources. Yet the humanitarian and intelligence benefits far exceeded this modest investment. The survey also documents failures. Approximately 5,000 Japanese civilians died by suicide during final battle phases, despite American humanitarian appeals. This represents roughly 8% of civilians in combat zones. While tragic, the 92% survival rate dramatically exceeds earlier campaigns where suicide rates approached totality. Comparative analysis with European theater operations provides context. German civilian populations generally did not require extensive humanitarian intervention because Nazi propaganda had not systematically encouraged civilian suicide. Japanese civilian populations required active psychological warfare to overcome indoctrination toward death. The Saipan precedent proved crucial for developing effective counter-propaganda. The report concludes that humanitarian policies served multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. They provided moral authority for American actions, they facilitated intelligence gathering, they prepared psychological conditions for occupation, they demonstrated American values while defeating enemies, They created precedents that influenced subsequent operations. The chocolate bars thus represented sophisticated strategy rather than mere sentiment. American military leadership absorbed these lessons. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, explicitly referenced Saipan precedents when planning occupation policies. His administration emphasized humanitarian treatment, economic reconstruction, and psychological rehabilitation, based partly on Pacific campaign experiences. The strategic victory of compassion extended beyond immediate military benefits to long-term diplomatic and political effects. American humanitarian behavior during wartime created foundation for post-war reconciliation. Japanese civilians who experienced American kindness became advocates for cooperation during occupation. The psychological preparation begun with chocolate bars facilitated the transformation of Japan from enemy to ally. Defense Department analysts identified key principles from the Saipan experience. Humanitarian policies must be genuine, not merely propaganda. They must be consistent across time and units. They must be adequately resourced despite competing military priorities. They must be culturally informed, recognizing how different populations perceive humanitarian gestures. They must be integrated with military operations rather than treated as separate activities. These principles influenced post-war American military doctrine. Field manuals incorporated humanitarian considerations into operational planning. Training programs emphasized cultural awareness and civilian protection. Logistics planning allocated resources for civilian relief. Intelligence gathering included assessment of civilian attitudes and needs. The military institution learned that humanitarian effectiveness served strategic interests. The Saipan experience thus produced lasting institutional change. American military forces, traditionally focused on combat effectiveness, expanded their professional identity to include humanitarian capabilities. This transformation, beginning with individual acts of kindness on a Pacific island, evolved into systematic doctrine that shaped American military operations for decades. The chocolate bars of July 1944 became the foundation for strategic thinking that recognized humanitarian power as complementary to military power. Compassion proved to be effective strategy. September 8, 1951, San Francisco, California, representatives from 48 nations gather at the War Memorial Opera House to sign the Treaty of Peace with Japan. The document formally ends World War II in the Pacific and establishes Japan's restoration to the international community. The ceremony marks the culmination of a transformation that began 7 years earlier with chocolate bars on a battlefield. The treaty negotiations, conducted over previous months, reflected assumptions about Japanese civilian character, shaped partly by wartime humanitarian experiences. American negotiators, many of whom served in Pacific theater operations, remembered Japanese civilians who chose survival when offered genuine alternatives to death. This memory influenced their approach to post-war settlement. Japanese diplomats negotiating the treaty brought their own memories. Some had family members who survived Saipan or subsequent campaigns. Others knew civilians whose attitudes toward America transformed through experiencing humanitarian treatment. These personal connections to humanitarian precedents influenced their willingness to accept peace terms and embrace reconciliation. The occupation period between surrender in August 1945 and the treaty signing in September 1951 demonstrated that Saipan precedents scaled successfully. Millions of Japanese civilians, like thousands on Saipan, discovered that American administration emphasized reconstruction rather than revenge. The humanitarian policies tested in combat continued during occupation. Statistical evidence documents the transformation. In 1945, public opinion surveys showed that 92% of Japanese civilians viewed Americans negatively. By 1951, 73% viewed Americans positively or neutrally. This dramatic shift reflected sustained humanitarian behavior during occupation, combined with memories of wartime kindness like the chocolate bars. Individual stories illustrate the broader pattern. Shizuko Miura, the Saipan refugee who chose surrender at Mapi Point, became a liaison between occupation authorities and Japanese communities during Reconstruction. Her testimony about American humanitarian behavior on Saipan gave her credibility when encouraging cooperation with occupation policies. She represented thousands of similar individuals whose wartime experiences shaped post-war attitudes. Kenji Matsumoto, the former Imperial Army sergeant who gradually accepted American administration at Camp Susupe, returned to Japan during repatriation in 1946. He became a vocal advocate for cooperation with occupation authorities, explicitly citing his Saipan experiences. His transformation from enemy soldier to reconstruction supporter exemplified the psychological journey millions completed. The children who received chocolate bars on Saipan grew up during occupation and reconstruction. By the treaty signing, they were teenagers and young adults forming their generation's attitudes toward America. Their childhood memories of American kindness influenced their embrace of democratic reforms, economic partnership, and military alliance. The chocolate bars thus invested in future generations. Economic data documents successful reconciliation. By 1951, Japanese industrial production had recovered to approximately 80% of pre-war levels under American-supported reconstruction. Trade between America and Japan, non-existent during wartime, grew rapidly during occupation. Economic interdependence replaced military conflict. The San Francisco Treaty contained lenient terms compared to punitive settlements after previous wars. Reparations remained modest. Territorial adjustments limited. Sovereignty restoration occurred quickly. These generous terms reflected American confidence that humanitarian precedents had created foundation for stable peace. The investment in humanitarian behavior during wartime yielded diplomatic dividends during peacemaking. The treaty signing ceremony itself symbolized transformation. Japanese diplomats and American officials, who 7 years earlier had been mortal enemies, now collaborated on mutual security arrangements. The bitterness that characterized wartime propaganda had dissolved through sustained humanitarian interaction. The chocolate bars of 1944 had grown into diplomatic partnership. By 1951, historical analysis reveals that humanitarian precedents influenced post-war stability in ways purely military victory could not have achieved. Japanese acceptance of defeat and cooperation with occupation stemmed partly from recognition that American power included both strength and mercy. The combination proved more durably effective than either alone could have been. The Saipan legacy extended beyond bilateral relations to influence broader American strategic thinking. Policymakers recognized that winning wars required not only defeating enemies militarily, but also winning psychological victories that facilitated lasting peace. This recognition, born from experiences like Saipan, shaped American approach to subsequent conflicts and occupations. 70 years after chocolate bars on Saipan, Japan and America maintained close alliance characterized by economic partnership, military cooperation, and cultural exchange. The transformation from mortal enemies to close allies required many factors: wise leadership, institutional reform, economic development, and shared strategic interests. But the foundation included humanitarian gestures during wartime that demonstrated American values and created psychological conditions for reconciliation. The chocolate bars remained powerful symbols. They represented individual compassion, operating within institutional humanitarian policy. They contradicted enemy propaganda through simple acts of kindness. They validated surrender by proving promises genuine. They planted seeds of future reconciliation in soil fertilized by wartime suffering. A Japanese mother on Saipan in July 1944, watching an American Marine offer chocolate to her terrified child, witnessed a moment that would echo through decades. Her choice to accept that offered kindness rather than embrace indoctrinated death contributed to a future neither she nor the Marine could have imagined, lasting peace between their nations. The documentary record preserves their moment, the historical analysis explains its significance, but the simple human truth transcends documentation. Compassion proved stronger than propaganda, humanity overcame ideology, and chocolate bars built bridges across the deepest chasms of war.